Welcome to our Wednesday night study of Romans. It's good to have you here. A little more familiar surroundings than crossroads and cemeteries and such tonight. But welcome to the parlor. And one of the important things about this parlor is around this table, we've had family gatherings, around funerals. We've had church family meet to consider hard discussions and family business. And one of the great things about a table and the family table is that we usually are more vulnerable when we're sitting around a table eating. Our conversation becomes more and more pointed, sometimes softer, and others more inviting. But the family table is a sacred trust area. In the work that I do on a daily basis in my other world, in fundraising, I like to think of the family table as that sacred space where people invite me to have those sacred discussions about their estates, about what they would like to do for their family members, to try to make decisions about their assets that they want to pass on to their family, how to protect those assets or transfer them to their charities so that there's impact beyond their life and legacy. But the family table, to me, it signifies an invitation based on relationship and trust. That you have to earn your way, in a sense, to the family table. It's not something that just comes naturally. In Middle Eastern society, it was always understood that if you ate with your enemy, she or he was no longer your enemy. Table fellowship was that strong. It was that much of a symbol. And when you look particularly at Jewish society and Jewish heritage, there was no more sacred space than the table when it was set for the Seder, the Passover Seder. Now this is the Wednesday after Easter. You may be thinking, wait a minute, we just celebrated Easter and Passover was before Easter at all. This is an important part of our journey with Romans, though. We are at that point in Romans chapters 9 through 11, and we want to sort of take that as a body tonight, because the writer of Romans is Paul, who was formerly known as Saul. And when we first meet him in the book of Acts, he was overseeing the stoning of Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr. When he was being stoned, the biblical testimony is that Saul was standing there as the people who were picking up rocks and getting ready to throw them laid their coats at his feet. And it shows very clearly, it states very clearly that he approved of what was going on. Now, why is that important to the book of Romans? Tonight, I wanted to just put us in the context of the Passover and the table fellowship, because when we read chapters 9 through 11 in Romans, we see that Paul is bringing to the crescendo, to the very point that he's been trying to make all the way up to this point. And that is, Israel has been entrusted with the law and the prophets. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Messiah means simply, or literally, anointed one. And when you translate Messiah into Greek, which the scriptures were translated from Hebrew to Greek, it translated to Christ. So when we say Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name. Christ means Jesus the Anointed One. And for us to really continue to understand Paul's writings here in chapters 9 through 11, we have to go back and revisit and understand Paul's deep desire and understanding of himself as a Jew, and that Jesus was a Jew. Jesus attended synagogue. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. Jesus came to fulfill the law. All of those things that Paul has been teaching up through chapter 8 in Romans, that we're saved by grace through faith, that we are made right, justified, put in right alignment with God by grace of God through faith. He talks about the election of Israel as God's chosen people through whom the law would come, and how the law served as a function to show us our sinfulness, our brokenness, our missing the mark, and how God's grace and how his mercy through Israel redeemed, and then through the fullness of Christ was able to take our sinfulness and cover it. And then the pouring out of God's Holy Spirit that allows us to live in that faith, as we examined in chapter 8. The Spirit intercedes for us. All of that really speaks to the redemption story, and following the redemption story of the Passover. I don't think it's an accident that we get to this point of Paul's writing in Romans, that we start to hear how Israel rejected the Christ, the anointed one, that was sent to complete and fulfill the law and actually live out the grace that Israel was intended to live out. You see, Israel was chosen among all nations not because it was strong, not because it was a military power, not because it was an economic center. Just the opposite. Israel was chosen as no people so that God would make them a people, so that all glory would come to God. The Passover, and this is a Passover Haggadah, and it's well worn because I've done many, many Passovers through the years in the churches I've served and with families. But the Passover was to be celebrated as a family around the family table. And Paul is now in a place where he's wanting to share with the people of Israel, the Jews of Rome, to say, this is my understanding about who we are, and this is my understanding about whose we are, and also what we've missed, and what God's desire and promise is to all of Israel. If you don't get anything else out of what I'm teaching tonight and trying to connect, the anchor text tonight really is in chapter 11, where he's talking about us being grafted on, that the purpose of Christ being rejected was to open the door to all nations, to fulfill what Isaiah had been saying about that all the Gentiles, that God would be a light to the nation, that Israel would be a light to all nations, and that the Gentiles would see that light and respond as well. And Paul has taken up that mantle again, where he started in chapter 3, that all have fallen short, that all people are under judgment, Jew, Gentile, all people have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The anchor text, though, is this, that for I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fulfillment of the Gentiles has come. And so all Israel will be saved. And this is, so all Israel will be saved. The prayer shawl that Paul would have worn and other faithful Jews would have worn at the Seder, particularly the men, would have to do the covering of the head. The prayer shawl has 4 tassels signifying the 4 corners of the earth. That in the prayer we should be praying for all nations, for all people. But somehow it had gotten narrowed to that we're just going to pray for the Jews around the world. The 3 stripes on any of the prayer shawls is a reminder that 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, there were 3 times of prayer that are referred to in Scripture that we're called a prayer. In the Jewish community, it was called a prayer 3 times a day. But on the night of the Passover, it was a reminder that Israel had been, again, saved, redeemed, plucked from slavery for a purpose. And the Passover, if you remember, comes from the book of Exodus, when the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt. And after many, many plagues that had been brought upon them by the work of God through Moses, finally it was the death of the firstborn. And on the night before the plague was to happen, the Jewish people were instructed to slaughter a lamb and place the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and lintel, so that when the angel of death came through Egypt that night, those families would be passed over. And the thing is, when families would gather for centuries after, and when Passover was established, and families would gather around their table, it became an order, the Haggadah. It became an order and a service that just families, it was not done like Christians do communion as a whole body. This was a solemn family celebration where you gathered the elders together, and the youngest person in the family had the duty of asking the 4 questions of why is this night different from all other nights. On other nights we get to eat anything, but tonight we only eat bitter herbs, and on other nights we sit, and tonight we recline, and other nights we eat bread, but tonight only unleavened bread. That the formation of the questions becomes the formation of the answers. The rest of the Passover Seder answers. We were held in slavery, and God saw our suffering, and God heard our cry, and he sent Moses, and then there were the plagues, but then the slaughter of the lamb and the sacrifice of the lamb, as it were, on Passover night, that each family was to gather inside their home. And watch this, friends. The blood of the lamb, the blood of the sacrificed lamb, was to be placed on the lintel, which is the cross beam that goes across the top of the door. It was to be placed on the lintel, and they would take the blood and they'd put it on this plant called hyssop, which is kind of like a brush. And they would take the blood of the lamb and they'd put it on the lintel and on each doorpost. Now just take a look at the motion that would be required to do. You take the blood and you put it on the lintel and on each doorpost. You see anything significant about that motion? Here, here, and here. And those inside were passed over, and they lived because they had the blood of the Lamb that sealed the door of their family. And Paul, in taking up this notion of Israel had rejected the Anointed One, the Christ, the Lamb, he begins to say that this is part of the judgment that came. Now, I want to be very quick to say that some people have taken this relationship between Jesus followers and Jewish folks, and there have been some very, very dark times in the life of the church, very dark times in the life of history, where Christians actually killed Jews, accused them of being Christ's crucifiers, and have created animosity. But the reason this anchor text in chapter 11 is so important is that Paul doesn't see a disconnect between the chosenness, the election of Israel, and the people of Israel, those who became Christ followers, and the work of God to graft, if you've ever been an agricultural person, of grafting in this branch called Gentiles into the root of Jesse, into the tree of life that God has created through his chosen people. Paul doesn't see a disconnect, but a grafting in, so that all Israel will be saved. A very, very important text, that if you are a Christ follower, if you're a Jesus follower, you have been grafted into the story of Israel, that we have been created and grafted into that story of election and grace and mercy that began with God's creation and God's choosing Israel. Now, this is a different kind of understanding than sometimes we think of Israel. having studied under some rabbis at Emory, that there's a different kind of understanding of I'm Jewish because I'm ethnically Jew, or I'm Jewish because I'm politically or nationally Jew, or I am Jewish because I am religiously identifying myself with Israel, the one who struggles with God, which is what Israel means, one who struggles with God. That's why Jacob was given that name, Israel, because he wrestled with God in the wilderness. That as a Christ follower, we're grafted into that story. And Israel's story becomes Jesus' story as he fulfills the role of Israel, being faithful to God, that then opens up the whole notion of being a light to the nations, because Christ died for all people, including his own people, including Israel. And Paul makes this case because he's a Pharisee. He understood that on the night of, during the Seder, that the rehearsal of the story of redemption and being led out of Egypt, when they would take the shank bone of the lamb and they would hold it up and they would remember the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, and they would dip their bitter herbs in salt water to be reminded of the tears of slavery and the years of oppression that Israel had been under. And they would hold up the egg as a symbol of fertility and the future hope that was being given. And they would mix this mixture of applesauce and mush and cinnamon to be reminded of the mortar that they continued to have to make bricks without straw under the oppression of Pharaoh. And there was a hidden piece of unleavened bread that folks would look to, which would become interpreted by Christ as his body. All of these symbols, because Paul was writing to a church, a group of people in Rome who were both a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. And he's been setting this whole stage all the way up to chapter 9 through 11 to say, we're all in the same boat, friends. We've all fallen. We're all under the subject, the condemnation of sin, because we all experience death. The law has not been able to save us. We have not been able to live perfectly and be able to save ourselves. Israel did not live by faith for a long time, but began to drift into trying to live by works, and it failed, and it blinded the eyes of the generation in which Jesus came, because they couldn't see him as Messiah. And now the Gentiles are responding to that, because Paul had planted all these churches really in Gentile communities, Corinth and Thessalonica and Laodicea and all around Ephesus, which were predominantly a mixture of people. And now he is saying, I don't want any of you to get the wrong idea, because God still is faithful to Israel. But now we have to understand that Israel is not just something you're born into. A lot of us in the church sometimes confuse our church membership or our church attendance with being a Christ follower. If I just go to church, if I just go and plant myself on a pew, then isn't that enough? And won't God just like me? And Paul is saying even to the people of Israel, it's not about your outward works, but the circumcision of the heart, which means that I'm broken before God, that I'm allowing this God of the universe to be Lord of my life, and I recognize that he's faithful to his word and that he has chosen me. I was having a conversation, another tailgate conversation with my neighbor Chris last night, and he was asking, he said, do you think Paul could have said no to Jesus on the road to Damascus? And what he's referring to is that Saul, who was standing watching over Stephen's death, was going on hot pursuit, according to Acts, to round up, to imprison people who were Jesus followers. When the risen Jesus appeared to me, and you go, this is why you're doing this after Easter. Yes, because the risen Jesus continued to engage people, meet people, like you, like me, like Saul. The reason Saul changed from a hard Pharisee willing to watch people stoned or imprisoned for following Jesus is because he met Jesus. And the question Chris said, is it so much a hardness of our heart that we would think if we met the living Jesus that we'd go, nah, no thanks? Did Paul, when he met the risen Jesus, did he ever have the first thought of going, nah, I don't want to do what you're talking about? Sometimes we make free will an idol in our lives as well. And my notion to you and what's displayed here in the Seder, was Paul's talking about here, is not a rejection of Israel based on, well, we made our own free will. Paul's trying to say, I met the living Jesus, and his love and his reality was so overwhelming that he desires all Israel to be saved. He desires all of us. And when we allow ourselves to really meet the living Jesus, who's not bound by just some historical moment 2,200 years ago, but are willing to accept that he is meeting us in our table, in our family table, that he wants to talk about our future and our legacy. He wants to talk about our assets and how are we going to affect change in our families forever. Paul just simply fell blind, and his life became a living yes to Jesus. Just like I pray your life will become a living yes to Jesus. That you will allow him to sit at your table. Allow him to affect your future for eternity. I pray this is a blessing to you this week, and I pray that as we get back together on Sunday, you will be blessed. We're going to have a baby dedication this week, and in the coming days, we also have a couple of very special every baptism is special, but it's just been an anointed season of the living Jesus sitting at our table at First Baptist, and we just want to say yes to him and be a living yes to him in our community. Hope you have a good night. God bless you.